Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of How to Study Chess Endgames. And so, how do you study chess endgames? There are many different ways you can do it. Uh, Read books on the endgame, watch videos, of course. But whatever you learn, you want to make sure that you practice and go over by playing friends, playing against the computer with different end games, or you can just play positions out on the board and practice them. And so in part one, we went over the basics of what you would need for a player that is under 1,000 rating. So we covered that you need to know the difference between checkmate and stalemate. That way you can avoid stalemates, especially if you're winning a game. You don't want to end up with a draw because you stalemated. And then we also went over the overkill checkmates, where you're winning, you have a lot of extra material, and we covered how to checkmate with a king and two queens versus a lone king, two rooks, and also a queen and a rook versus a lone king. And with those checkmates, I discussed the leapfrog or staircase method that you can use, a technique you can use with those two rooks, two queens, or rook and queen to checkmate. And then we also went over the king and queen and king and rook checkmating technique, where you use the box method to make a box and slowly make that box smaller until you trap your opponent's king at the edge of the board and checkmate. And so part two today, we will go over the things you will start to need as you go up above 1,000. And so the first thing, or one of the first things to know as you go over 1,000 in your rating, is what can and what cannot checkmate versus a lone king. So I'll go over a few of those quickly. So the first thing that can checkmate is, of course, a king and a queen versus a lone king. So if we look at the analysis here, you've probably been looking at this position already. So how do you complete this checkmate? So in this position, it was white's turn to move, and he's forced into the corner, and the queen can checkmate. So that's the first thing to know, of course, which you should know already. King and queen, yes, they can checkmate against a lone king. And we'll go on to the next example. Let's see here. So now two rooks. Of course, two rooks can also checkmate versus a lone king. And here they use that leapfrog or staircase method to trap the king on the edge of the board for a checkmate. All right, on to the next example here. And now we have king and lone rook against king. And yes, that definitely checkmates. And here we have the king forced to go into the corner, and the rook can go up here for a checkmate. And of course, you always have to be aware and make sure you don't stalemate when you're performing these checkmates, which you should have learned in part one, how to avoid stalemates. Okay, so next we will go over two bishops. Yes, two bishops can definitely checkmate versus a lone king. And so in this example, the bishops work together with the king to cut off the opponent's king and checkmate him in the corner here. And next we have example number 5. So this is a very tricky one, but yes, king with a knight and bishop can checkmate against a lone king. but this is a very tricky checkmate that some chess masters say that you may not even need to use or learn how to use this checkmate, as at least one master said it never occurred in his entire career, and others only came across it a few times. But it's something interesting to practice on the board to learn how the knight and the bishop can coordinate together to complete perform checkmates. And in this example, we have the king having nowhere to go, forced up into the corner. And after check, he moves and mate. So here's a checkmate with king, knight, and bishop versus lone king. Okay, now we go on to, let's see here, this next example. So this one seems unfair, but generally a king and two knights cannot checkmate a lone king. Now it is possible, but usually only with the help of your opponent. So if they know what they're doing and they stay out of the corner, so in this position, if it's black's turn to move, all he has to do to get a draw is to stay out of this corner, and you would not be able to checkmate. So if he just moves here, then there's no way for these knights and king to mate him. But if he blunders and goes into the corner, then of course knight here to f7 will mate. So technically, two knights and a king can checkmate, but only if your opponent blunders by going into the corner and walking into a mate. If he stays away from the corners, then the knights and king cannot mate. And as for the rest of the pieces, a king and lone bishop or a king and lone knight versus a king cannot mate. A king and pawn cannot mate unless that pawn promotes to a piece that can, like a rook or a queen. Okay, let's move on to the next example here. All right, so after you know what can and cannot checkmate, which is important to know, and why should you study chess endgames to begin with? Well, one good reason, other than learning how to checkmate your opponent, is that by knowing what pieces can checkmate and what cannot, it will help you in the middle game steer the position into something favorable for you. You'll be able to determine what pieces you need to win or save a draw. So it's valuable information knowing your end games that can help steer you towards a win. Okay, so in this position, we have black. It's his turn to move, and he will promote to a queen here. So many beginners think that, well, if my opponent has a queen and I have a knight or a bishop, that I can put up resistance and maybe squeeze out a draw. But king and queen versus a king and bishop or king and knight should definitely win for the side with the queen. And so I'll show you this example. So here the bishop moves, and now you can play using the box method that we learned in part 1 to slowly trap the king to the edge of the board. And so play may progress like this. You make the box smaller. If the king tries to stay near the bishop, then you will have to bring your king in to help eventually. But you definitely need the king and queen to work together. You can kind of stay on the light squares if it's a dark squared bishop. So if you keep your king and queen mostly on the squares that are opposite the squares that the bishop occupy, then that should keep you safe and you shouldn't have any problems. So if the king is trying to stay near the bishop, Here, the queen can make this box smaller, and if the king tries to move forward here, keeping your king away, well, now the queen can check, driving the king back, and your king can move in and try to attack the bishop with the queen and corral the opponent's king at the same time. So the bishop, if it moves away, here you can just press further, try to trap the king along the edge of the board here. So if he moves here, you just attack further. The king moves, and now you can bring your queen into this position, or sorry, your king into this position to work with your queen. And now it doesn't really matter what this bishop does. You will be able to ignore the bishop and then just checkmate the opponent's king on the edge of the board here. Now, you do the same thing with a king and queen versus the king and knight. You just kind of ignore the knight and try and push the king to the edge of the board. But with a knight, you must be careful of forks. So always be aware of forking possibilities where you do not want the knight to be able to fork your king and queen, and then a one game will turn into a draw. So watch out for forks. I won't show the knight example. You can try and play that out on a board or against the computer or a friend, but it's basically the same as this. You just kind of ignore the knight except for keeping an eye on forking possibilities, and you just slowly trap the king to the edge of the board where you can mate him. All right, let's move on. And so we already covered what can and cannot checkmate. That's valuable knowledge that you need to know when you get up over 1,000, so you know how to steer the middle game into the end game, and you know if you can mate or not. And then we went over that queen versus a minor piece, so king and queen versus king and bishop or knight, is winning for the side with the queen. Now, another valuable piece of information is how to use your king in the end game. A lot of beginners try to keep their king safe and don't use the king much and keep it held back and protected, which that's fine until the end game. In the end game, the king becomes very important and must participate. So we see here a common position that occurs often where you have a king trying to stop a pawn from promoting. So in this position, it's black's turn to move, and this is a very important position to learn. I did another video a while back on this type of position. So here, you want to stay in front of this pawn and keep white's king back and not allow the white king to come up in front of his pawn. So an easy method is to step straight back from the pawn, like black did here. And this allows you to, whenever your opponent's king tries to go up in front of the pawn, well, then you can just step in front of their king and you achieve what's called the opposition. So the opposition is just the endgame technique where the kings face off against each other, and whoever's turn it is has to step to the side or give ground if only the kings were involved. But here we have a pawn. So in this position, white is likely to just start pushing his pawn. Well, now you just jump in front of this pawn, and the king will be forced to move here to protect it. So once again, you can step straight back from this pawn, which allows you, once white moves forward, to step in front of the king and block this king from making any progress. And now, if the pawn moves forward, once again, stay in front of it and he will have to protect it, and then step straight back once again. And if the king tries to come over on the other side, then step in front of the king, and you just repeat this process. If the pawn goes forward now, you step in front of the pawn, and this will be a stalemate. If he moves away from the pawn, you just capture, of course. But if he protects the pawn, then we have a stalemate. So that is one example of why the kings are very important in the endgame, and you must learn how to use your king and the opposition to prevent pawns from promoting, so you will be able to hold a draw in this position. And also, if your opponent makes a mistake and you have the extra pawn, study this position on the board, play it against friends or a computer, and try and see how you can take advantage of your opponent's mistake if they do not step straight back from the pawn, if they don't use the opposition. This is a good endgame to practice. All right, let's look at the next example here. All right, so in this position, we show an example where white will take an advantage of a mistake made by black. So black moves, but he does not move straight back here. So this is a losing mistake that white can take advantage of. So he moves forward, taking the opposition here. And now, if black steps in front of the pawn, it is too late to save the draw, because now when the pawn pushes forward, it squeezes the king out from in front of the pawn. He cannot stay here, or excuse me, he cannot move here because the pawn guards that and the king guards this. So he's squeezed out to the side, allowing white's king to move forward and gain control of the queening square. And after a move by black, we have a queen promotion, a pawn promotion to a queen, and white will be easily winning here. All right, on to the next example. All right, my final example here, and the last bit of information that is valuable to know once you are in the 1,000 to under 1,200 bracket. So once your rating is in that group, then all this information in part 2 will be valuable to know. And here we see a pawn that is a rook pawn. So rook pawns, they cause many draws because the defender, all they have to do is get in front of this pawn in the corner, and they're very limited on the moves they can make. This king can only move back and forth here to g8 and h8. And so in this position, if the pawn tries to push forward, it's an immediate draw here by stalemate, as the white king covers g7 and the pawn cuts off g8, and the king cannot do anything, and it's a stalemate. So that is the last piece of information that you need to know about. Practice endgames with rook pawns, because they lead to many stalemating and drawing opportunities, because the defender just has to jump in front of the pawn, and the pawn can be pushed forward until the king blocks it, but then stalemates result. So there you have it. Those are the extra bits of knowledge that you need. I'll review those quickly. So if we go back to part 1, so if you're under 1,000, you just need to know the difference between stalemate and checkmate. That way you can avoid stalemates when you're winning, or achieve a stalemate when you're trying to hold a draw. And the overkill checkmates, where you use king plus 2 queens, 2 rooks, or rook and queen versus a lone king, and you can use that leapfrog or staircase method. And then finally we covered king and rook plus, king and rook versus king, or king and queen versus lone king. And you can use that box method to trap them. So that was vital information to know for the under 1,000 player. And then in part 2 here, we covered for 1,000 to under 1,200. Then you need to know what can and can't checkmate versus a lone king. So we covered that king and queen and king and rook definitely checkmate. King and 2 rooks, of course, checkmate. And also king and 2 bishops and king, bishop, and knight checkmate against lone king. Although that king, bishop, and knight is quite difficult, and it's a tricky mate. Practice it yourself and see. Okay, also, we went over how to use your king in the end game. So in the end of the game, it is vital that you bring the king out to help participate and help you fight in the end game. And opposition is very important, which I'll cover more of that later, but just know the basics of opposition, where you use your king to press your opponent's king back, and you can use that to promote a pawn in the end game or hold off someone trying to promote and achieve a stalemate. And then the last thing we covered was these rook pawns, which lead to many drawing and stalemating opportunities if you just put your king in front of that rook pawn. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed part 1 and part 2 here of how to study chess endgames. And once again, how do you study those? You can watch these videos, check out some books at the library, or buy some books. Also, whatever you learn, review it by playing friends, setting up positions on a board, or playing positions against the computer. Just try different things out. And also, this is kind of a guideline, what I've showed you, for what to learn for under 1,000 or under 1,200. And there's a lot of other information that you can learn, but this is stuff that you should master and make sure you know it before you dive into more complicated stuff. All right, this video has probably gone on long enough. I thank everyone who has stuck around to the end here. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions. And if you haven't checked out part 1, check that out. Also, you can go to my channel, Nick Butts Chess, where I have many other videos that you can enjoy. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.